Thank you for that. Lovely. So at this point of the evening, folks, Alan and Adam are going to have a bit of a chat, a discussion. But I will say just a few words about Adam before we get going. Adam Feinstein, who was born in Cambridge, is a poet, translator, biographer, journalist, Hispanist, film critic, and autism authority. Bloomsbury published his biography of the Chilean Nobel Prize-winning poet Pablo Neruda, A Passion for Life, in 2004, and updated in 2013. Harold Pinter called it a masterpiece.
I didn't pay him anything to say that. Not a penny.
Adam has published many books of translations of Latin American poets, including Neruda, Reuben Dario, Jose Marti, Mario Benedetti, and Pablo Antonio Quadra. He has also published 3 acclaimed books on autism. He is an acknowledged authority on the life and work of Michael Curtis, whose films he has introduced across the UK, as well as on Latin American cinema. Adam was an advisor on Pablo Larraín's 2016 film Neruda. He has lectured on Neruda, translation, autism, and film all over the world. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good evening. And it's a pleasure for me to be here with my good friend Alan, with whom we talk about music, film, and poetry, and we've seen hundreds of films over the years, thousands, I'm sure. So my first question is about inspiration. I'm always wary about asking a poet about inspiration. Molly Haskell, in the latest Sight and Sound, has an obituary of the late, great Jenna Rowlands, the actress, and Haskell asks, did her husband, John Cassavetes, did he invent Jenna, or did he unleash her? Which is a wonderful question. And of course, you could say the same about poets with their poems. So my first question is, what unleashed these particular poems, or this book of poems? What gave you the idea?
It goes back quite a time, really, till I was very young, probably about 16, 17. I started to write poems when I was about 17. And of course, I've been seeing films from very, very early on. I have a strong memory of being aged 9 and a cinema queue in Liverpool. My parents took me to see Hitchcock's Vertigo, which was an extraordinary experience then. And I think I became hooked on cinema. But anyway, the idea for the film poems, I was writing poems. I started writing little poems, but I wrote one about Bergman's persona, in fact, and Vertigo, which they're okay. I don't have them now. I mean, well, I have them somewhere, but then they'll be published. One was almost accepted by a magazine. But I suddenly, was about 18, I got this idea of writing a whole book, poems, but sort of, film verse. And I knew of the critic Philip French, so a sort of fellow Liverpudlian, actually. I found out his address from his publisher, and I wrote to him saying, do you think anybody would be interested in this project? And so on. And he wrote back to me personally. They were the days when people wrote back to you personally, typed a letter, and it was personally signed by Philip French. Said, I'm very sorry, I'm actually working on the same idea myself, and it will be published soon by Faber. It's called the Faber Book of Movie Verse, and so on. So then I forgot about this for a very long time. I went to university, did English, then I wasn't writing for a while, then I was writing screenplays and short stories and that sort of thing. And I only came back to writing poetry about 16, 17 years ago, because the death of my partner actually triggered off something that made me want to write verse again. And film images were cropping up, and there are a couple of poems about films which are in my other collections as well, and so on. But this idea of doing films, a film book which would be illustrated, was still in my mind. And I was taken up by The High Window, published by them. And God, David Cook, bless him, you know, he liked the idea. So it took me about 3-4 years to write. There are 39 poems in the book, probably thinking of Hitchcock's 39 steps, in fact, I think. I stopped at 39. I could have carried on and on and on. In fact, the introduction of the book says, why didn't I write a poem by John Ford or Kenneth Anger or Visconti or, you know, anybody? Well, you could, there's so much. But what I wanted to do, particularly with these poems, was to take the prose poem form, and I wanted to write a hybrid. I wanted to combine an epiphany, a film experience, an homage to the director or star, film criticism, and an autobiographical memoir. And it seemed to me the prose poem was the ideal form, because on the page it's like a rectangle square, it's like a screen. So that seems to be right, it's compact, contained. And I don't know what order they came. I think the Bergman one was one of the first poems I actually wrote.
Persona.
Persona, yes, Persona, yes. And they came very quickly. And I certainly didn't want to write poems about the greatest films ever made. Or I mean, some of the greatest films are my favourite films, or some of my favourite films are not necessarily the greatest films ever made. I mean, there's even one poem in the book which is about a very trashy film called Messer of Lost Women, and so on. It's a guilty pleasure film, and so on.
It's dreadful.
It's dreadful, it's really dreadful.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's compulsive viewing. You watch it on YouTube, you know, it's just mad. There is a kind of journey in them to some degree, and they came quickly. The images came quickly, and again, I think there's a point where I just had to stop. Really, I mean, I could have, just
I'm
carried
interested.
on.
You say they came quickly. This is fascinating because
Yes.
the process of writing a poem. I'm a poet as well,
Yes,
as you know.
sure.
I mean, going back to Persona,
Yes.
Bergman. There's an extraordinary scene in Bergman in
Yes.
Persona
Yes.
where Bibi Andersson, who plays the nurse,
Yes.
tells this erotic story to
Oh, God,
to
that's
Liv
good.
Ullmann.
Yes.
She tells it for 8 minutes,
That's right.
and the camera is focused on a close-up on Bibi Andersson.
That's right.
And then, unbelievably, the same story is told again,
Yes.
exactly word for word by Bibi Andersson, but the close-up is on Liv Ullmann's face. And people have asked him, what on earth were you doing? Why did you do that? You know, the same story. And he said, Bergman said, I had no idea how to cut, where to cut. It wasn't, I didn't plan it. I had no idea where to make any cuts. So I just thought, I'll just do the whole thing again with a close-up of the both actors. You know, normally I would cut, as you do a normal thing, a director would cut between the two people in a conversation. He said, I didn't know what to do it. So I'm just wondering whether a poem has this kind of force. It takes over, it forges itself almost. You know, do you found that sometimes?
Yes,
Yeah.
it can. It come very, very quickly. But then there's an awful lot of work to be done with it as well,
Right.
to polish it, refine it, make every word matter, and so on.
Yeah.
In fact, I did think of that moment in Persona to actually write a poem just about that moment. But I stood back. No. The interesting thing about, I should say, the other influence behind these poems was something I wanted to achieve. The films of Terence Davis, another poet, who quotes from films, film music was particularly in The Long Day Closes and so on. And the other influence beyond that is film criticism. There is David Thompson, Biographical Dictionary of Cinema. He writes very eloquently, sometimes a little too glibly, I find, and he recycles his words somewhat. But what I do appreciate, and the other reason why I suppose by prose poem, because I'm attracted to film prose as well. There are some critics who write so wonderfully well, And film criticism is not considered as an art form. Jonathan Rosenbaum goes about this an awful lot on his Facebook page, in fact. And he says, okay, probably only film buffs and cineasts actually really interested in reading film critics for a literary pleasure, like literary criticism. But there's a tradition. There's people like Andrew Cyrus, who wrote in the 60s his great American cinema book, which is enormously influential for filmmakers and revitalized our interest in American cinema, made us seriously look at the auteur theory. There's Manny Farber before him, very idiosyncratic. But in fact, I'd just like to read where I have here an extract from, here it is here. Andrew Cyrus. This is a terrific book he wrote on films of Joseph von Sternberg. It's published by the Museum of Modern Art. This is from '68. It's just an example of film prose, how poetically some critics can write. He's talking about Marlene Dietrich, who he made 6 truly marvelous films with. And anyway, here we go. This is ideally Sternberg. This is how ideally Sternberg directs his players, not by tampering with their faces to provide self-explanatory grimaces, but by creating a visual context in which the most unobtrusive acting effects become eloquently expressive. Sternberg's decor is then not the meaningless background of the drama, but its very subject, peering through nets, veils, screens, shutters, bars, cages, mists, flowers, and fabrics, to tantalize the male with fantasies of the female. Yet far from exaggerating his effects, Sternberg has perhaps calculated too closely. Dietrich particularly has been polished to an inhuman perfection beyond the accidental beauties of impulse and instinct. Her beauty is now so uninflected by dramatic development that even her cruelties are trivial. I think that's just marvelous writing. God, it's so poetic. It's beautiful writing, isn't it?
Talking about poetic, what do you think we mean by a poetic film? We talked about this over lunch the other day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to define. Sometimes it's surprising. For instance, I think one of the most poetic moments in film is Buster Keaton's Our Hospitality.
Absolutely.
Where early on you see the water, them flooding the fields, and you see a waterfall being formed. That waterfall goes on to become the set piece, the classic set piece at the end of the film. So you see it's a kind of echo, or physical detail. So you look at Louis Buñuel making that his last film, That Obscure Object of Desire, for instance, which is a wonderful film, and he was a stickler for detail, physical detail, which great poems are as well. So, for instance, you had the set designer scraping the walls of the stairway in an apartment block, and people couldn't work out why, and it's because the inhabitants of the block were poor immigrants and immigrant workers, and they'd often creep out at night without paying the bill, and they'd take their furniture with them, scraping the walls. I mean that, and Buñuel thought, I must capture that detail, that small, tactile, sensory detail. So do you think films have this, or that films can? Do you think films can do what poems can do in that sense of capture the sensory?
Yeah, well, they
immediacy?
They capture detail. They capture time. It's interesting what you said about the walls. But I was just thinking of Deno Antonioni when he was making the Red Desert. The grass around the industrial plant wasn't green enough, so he painted the grass greener.
Yeah,
in fact,
exactly.
But I came across this interesting definition of poetry and film in Tarkovsky's terrific book, Sculpting in Time. And he talks about funnily enough, recently I was just reviewing the book of the haiku, the Japanese poet Basho, and he says that Eisenstein was attracted to ancient Japanese poetry, and he quoted some examples and so on. And what attracts, this is Tarkovsky, what attracts me in haiku is its observation of life, pure, subtle, one with its subject. And he gives an example: the dew has fallen on all the spikes of black thorn, there hang little drops. This is pure observation. Its aptness and precision will make anyone, however crude his receptivity, feel the power of poetry and recognize, forgive the banality, the living image which the author has caught. And then he goes on to say, and though I'm very chary of making comparisons with other art forms, this particular example from poetry seems to me close to the truth of cinema, with the difference that prose and poetry use words by definition, while a film is born of direct observation of life. That, in my view, is the key to poetry and cinema. For cinema, image is essentially the observation of a phenomenon passing through time.
Yeah, that's the key, and that was my next question.
Yeah.
The time in the cinema,
Yes.
because this is the difference between cinema and other arts. Like I distrust comparing art forms.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult thing to do. But the difference with painting or indeed with poetry, the viewer can stop, can go back, can listen, can look again. In the cinema, I'm not talking about DVDs or now, but in the cinema, at least forward movement is inexorable. You're forced to, and you're all watching at the same time. Every member of the audience is watching at the same time. I think that's a major difference. Of course, Tarkovsky, his father, Arseny, was a poet and narrates his own poems in mirror, the great mirror. So this question of time in film, and also that quote brings up a maybe related question, which is Tarkovsky quotes Eisenstein.
Yes.
Eisenstein, this great editor, cutter,
Yes.
jump cuts.
That's right.
Tarkovsky, the anti-Eisensteinian,
Yes.
long take. Which I was going to ask, which kind of poet are you? Are you an Eisenstein or a Tarkovsky?
Oh,
I know
I
it's
don't know. I think of the montage with the long take or the long pan or the travelling shot and so. I mean, I think it's interesting you mentioned poetry in relation to, for example, T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland,
yeah.
which is often considered a very cinematic poem. Though Eliot himself was not a film goer, he was pretty indifferent to cinema, in fact. It's claimed that the only film he really enjoyed was Kurosawa's Japanese film on Macbeth called Throne of Blood. But the trouble is I can't find any evidence anywhere when he said this and to whom. But The Wasteland is a collage, certainly. You cut from the conversations in the pub, the literary references and allusions and so on. Which is I think he saw Potemkin, Battleship Potemkin. I think he must have seen that, the London Film Society when Ivan Montagu was running it and so on. So he was very aware of that, for example. But his great love was the musical, because he found a great spontaneity in the musical, and he didn't like script. He saw Laurel and Hardy, but the trouble is that was it was kind of perfected in a way. He liked the spontaneity. He didn't want things to be caught on film. And he detested modern theatre very much. It was pretty boring, I should think, in his time. And he loved the democracy and spontaneity of the cinema, the musical, which he thought less patronising than the cinema then. But again, I think Britta's bringing up this into question: what makes a poem cinematic?
Yeah.
And so on. And can you use cinematic techniques in a poem? I did discover one. In fact, I mean, I didn't want to come and quote the obvious bits of T.S. Eliot, Wasteland, and so on. This is a collection of poems by a man named Attilio Bertolucci. Now, he is the father of Bernardo Bertolucci, actually. And he was a very famous poet, very well translated. He died about 20 years ago, aged about 94 and so on. And there was an interesting poem in here, which I think you can see cutting going on, editing. It's called The Ants. The ants on the full-grown trunk of the acacia profit from the sun that warms October days, minute by minute, up and down on the rough bark of the tree. The ants are toiling against the coming winter. If I shift my glance to the light of the highway here, it is men and women I see toiling up and down. O single spirit of beings who live beside me on this open plain, bravely preparing to face the snow, help me confront the extinction of the daylight over our unequal houses, the kindling light. I love that because I think you've got to close up the ants, fascinated by the minutiae in front of him in life, and he shifts his glance to the highway, which could be either an it or a pan, people on the road. And then he talks about the extinction of the daylight. And it's almost as the poem is fading in and fading out as well.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, actually. Perhaps it's a very simple example of that, but I think it's a very good example of using cinematic sort of technique, actually, in a poem.
A fine poem.
Yeah, it's a fine poem.
Of course,
right?
his son, Bertolucci, the very first, that silent film you showed at the beginning, with the caged bird, it reminded me of the bars. The bars in Bertolucci's The Conformist.
Oh, yes.
Bars on the windows reminding us of how trapped he feels,
Yeah.
the protagonist feels.
Particularly the Conformist, the
The
light,
Conformist,
the lighting,
Conformista, yeah.
particularly the
Yeah,
Conformist.
exactly. Oh, that's what I'm talking about, the
Yeah, the
Conformist.
Conformist, that's right.
Yeah. That's the one, yeah. Let's talk a bit about memory, obviously, because that plays a big part, autobiographical memory.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, Francis Ford Coppola was interviewed recently about his new film Megalopolis, and he quoted Goethe saying that architecture is frozen music, and then he added, a painter stops time. He takes an image of time. Dancers have rhythm. Basically, art is the manipulation of time. All those movies that manipulate time are interesting because that's what we're doing with our memories, which is an interesting comment. I mean, of course, a film like Rumblefish, Coppola's Rumblefish, is all about the passage of time. Do you think you're doing this in your poems? I mean, do you think you're manipulating, you're reviving your own memories, and those of the reader? Because some are very searing. For instance, Distant Voices Do Not Survive. Very autobiographical.
Yes, I am. I mean, there is an autobiographical element in a lot that I write. Not in everything, but particularly in film, because it's very close to me, very personal. It has family memories, relationship memories, and so on. In fact, this Distant Voices is again Liverpool, my hometown, and when I saw it in 1988, it was released, it was a kind of revelation, actually, extraordinary. Like this was made. Terence Davis didn't live very far from me when he lived in Liverpool. I was born in Liverpool 8, he lived in Liverpool 7. And I should say something else, actually, coming back to time and memory. The origin of some of these poems, many years ago I tried to write a novel called The Spiral Movie, which began with a young child being taken to the cinema and taken to see the spiral staircase, in fact. And in fact, you'll find the opening chapter for this novel now abandoned, actually in my book here. And
So just before you read this, you're going to read Distant Voices now?
no,
Oh, well, a bit later.
a bit later.
I just want curious because you have no poems about poets, as far as I know.
No,
Probably because most of them are terrible.
no.
But you don't. I mean, you could have picked more. You could have picked A Quiet Passion, for instance, about Sequence of Soon,
Yes.
or Benediction about. Emily Dickinson's Quiet Passion,
That's
or Benediction. Maybe they're less They have less. Do they have less autobiographical?
They have less, yes.
Yes, so that's why this.
I mean, in fact, I think the only poem, I wrote a very bad poem once about Coleridge, very long, completely abandoned actually,
Right.
by being drunk in pubs. It was awful poem. But I think I've written one poem about the image of the swan, which appears very much in Mallarmé's poems, and so
right.
and the whiteness, and about what do you do with a metaphor you can't figure out how to fit into a poem, sort of thing, you know.
Yeah.
But I haven't actually written about poets. No.
No. No. Would you agree that most films about poets are not very adequate?
They're not very adequate. I mean, the film about Sylvia Plath is very poor. There was one about Ted Hughes at one point. There's quite a decent one about Dylan Thomas. I think the BBC did some years ago. Ken Russell did some good biopics. I like that because he wouldn't be.
The BBC one. You mean the BBC one?
Yeah, because he's not reverential, which drives people crazy sometimes. It drives me crazy sometimes. But he did one about Wordsworth and Coleridge, which somebody's now put on YouTube, and it's never been issued on DVD. I've forgotten the title. Is it Clouds of Glory? I think it's called. Yes, it's that's really good actually. Yes.
Yeah.
But I'd go for that more irreverent treatment.
Right.
Actually, you know, if I was going to do a very poem about a poet.
I don't know if I could talk to one or two specifically about one
Yes,
or two films.
talk about one or two.
Bonnie and Clyde, which is wonderful.
Thank you.
And it's deep, profoundly autobiographical.
It is that one.
Fascinating insight in how film can bring children closer to parents in a
Yes.
surprising way. Would you like to say something about
Yeah,
about that?
I was kind of apprehensive because my dad was a bit lazy, wouldn't go out to things. I would go take mum out to the cinema and so on, you know. So because we see this film called Bonnie and Clyde. Then I dispatched him off to the cinema. I thought, oh God, it's so violent. They'll probably hate it actually, because I mean, Bonnie and Clyde in its day was very violent indeed. Actually, it was a bit of a landmark film actually, and very upsetting. Considered sensationalistic. I mean, I think it's a masterpiece, and directed very beautifully, actually. Anyway, they came home, and they were delighted by the film. They said, oh God, I really loved it. They got engrossed with the story, and they were so happy. And I was so happy for them as well, actually. And I think sometimes when I've recommended films to people, being apprehensive, if I really love a film, it's like passing on a gift to them, you know.
Yeah.
I really want them to enjoy that. Of course, not everybody has the same taste as you. But that was, it was literally quite bonding, that actually, to have done that.
Yes, the power of film to bond.
The power of film to bond,
Exactly.
actually.
And there's another very tender, very moving poem you dedicate to Mizoguchi's masterpiece, Ugetsu.
Ugetsu, yes.
Ugetsu Monogatari.
Yes.
And you end with this beautiful image. Once I watched my mother mend a pair of trousers and argue with father till each forgiving stitch was outed. And now Mizoguchi's camera tracked down all evil spirits intent on destroying fired earthenware and any belief in the humility of sewing. And I was trying to get you to explain over lunch what you meant by humility of sewing. And poets don't always know what they mean.
I'm not quite sure even now by humility of sewing. But all I know is that, you know, Mum and Dad would have arguments at times at home. There was never violence at home. There was never an abusive relationship. There was no domestic violence, anything like that. But she would get fed up with him, and they'd argue, and then he would go off in the corner and smoke his pipe, sort of thing. And she would sew. She would do some darning, some knitting, sewing, and so on. And I think back now, I thought about the image the other day, and in fact, it was quite sad in a way. I think she was repressing so much of her real needs. You know, she wanted very simple things in life that she wasn't getting from my father because of his emotional meanness in many respects. So it was her escape, and that the humility of sewing was in a sense was
wonderful part. It really is wonderful.
Yeah.
I recommend
And
it.
in the film, it's great because you've got the humility of the potter.
Exactly.
You know, it's a great film.
And you have another poem, the other poem to Mizoguchi. I think there's at least one more where you have this,
Three.
which really, yeah, where you have this use of gerunds. I want you capture the rhythm.
Is that Sancho Daly?
Of The Life of a Horror. I think.
Life of a Horror, okay.
Yeah, yeah. I love those gerunds. All the crouching, swerving, running, stumbling, and falling cannot break or save her now.
Yeah.
Those repeated gerunds. I mean, that's cinematic.
Yeah, it is.
In the rhythm. Because
Yeah, it
cinema's
is.
about rhythm.
It's a
apart-
rhythm as
apart
well.
from anything else, and so's poetry.
Yeah.
That's where they do overlap. That's
But
what-
again, I think music is much more influenced me more greatly than cinema
Yes.
in many respects.
Yes.
Generally, for my poems,
Absolutely.
actually.
Well,
Because
as you
it's
know-
the sound and the sense are very important for a poem. You know,
As you know, my mother, Elaine Feinstein,
you're Elaine Feinstein, a wonderful translator.
who was a wonderful translator and a wonderful poet, would keep telling me, you know, when I say, any great poem has to sing. It has to
Absolutely.
sing. It has to be music.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not a great poem. That's as simple as that.
I miss that enormously now with
Yeah.
young poets. Don't have this singing quality
Yeah.
at all. It's gone.
I probably would argue the same about cinema. I think cinema, I'm not talking about soundtrack, I'm talking about the rhythms
The rhythm.
of the images
Yes.
of a great film.
Yes.
We've lost that, I think.
Yes.
Not completely, thank goodness. Oh yes, we talked about, I was going to ask you about Messe of Lost Women. Dreams in poems and film. Andre Breton, the great surrealist,
Yes.
said about someone he disliked, a bastard, he never dreams. that was his great insult. A wonderful quote.
That's a great
Wonderful
quote.
quote. And Buñuel called cinema an involuntary imitation of dream. Can poetry ever compete on that level? Can it imitate dreams? Should it aspire to that?
I'm worried about writing poems about dreams. They have a dreamy effect. I've written some prose where dream scenes in them, actually. And I was once published a book called The Writer's Books of Dreams, published by Serpent's Tail. When I just wrote, the dream itself seemed to be a little kind of parable for me, sort of thing. The period of my life when I was quite depressed and having some psychotherapy, and I was reading all these books on Jungian psychotherapy, and then I had a dream where Jung told me to stop reading books on psychotherapy. It's the worst thing you could do, kind of thing, and so on. So, but I'm a little wary about dreams. It's very, very hard to do dreams in films. I mean, I think Buñuel was a master at that. And I think, for me, still the greatest dream sequence is in Los Olvidados, which is one of the poems in my book.
Which is another wonderful poem in the book. And funny enough, I mean, you capture the brutality, the cruelty, but astonishing. I don't know whether you knew this, Adam,
But
but his screenwriter, Jean-Claude Carrière,
he
said that in his own book, The Secret Language of
that's a terrific
film,
book.
which is a fantastic book,
It's terrific.
Carrière says that Buñuel got really increasingly irritated as he got older when people started claiming that it was a cruel film, Los Olvidados.
Mm,
I wonder, what else is it not? If it's not cruel,
no.
but maybe he saw some humour where we don't necessarily see it. It's extraordinary comic.
No, it's a pitiless depiction, isn't it, of humanity? I mean, it's
It's merciless, isn't it?
It's merciless, yes. It's very hard to take, anyway, but it's not in your face sensationalism at all.
No.
It's that fear, that detachment makes it more horrific in many ways, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, the distancing from just the way a life can be disposed like that, like a piece of garbage.
It's interesting. Going back to dreams, though. Which is, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
fascinating that you say it's hard to do dreams in film or poetry even. And there's a wonderful quote in Sculpting in Time where Bresson says, "Poetry lies in precision."
Precision. That's right.
Which is a wonderful comment.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful comment.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about it.
It's what you leave out.
Yeah, it's what you leave out.
What you leave out, important. The understatement, actually. Unless you've got a Gothic imagination like Ken Russell, who can sometimes bring it off and so on. Dreams, they'll feel a bit embarrassing and overstated. It's like even depicting sex in cinema. It's still very hard to do, actually, convincingly. You know.
And a poem is like a short story, of course. Every word counts.
Absolutely, every word must count. Yes, yeah.
And going back to that use of objects, or Jean-Claude Carrière again said, one of the cinema's great strengths is to animate inanimate objects.
Yeah.
Poetry can do this too. Well, think of Pablo Neruda, whose anniversary of his death by the way, was celebrated today, this very day, by Kyoto. So think of his odes to the onion, to the tomato. He even wrote an ode to his socks, which, I mean, extraordinary. And he thought then, he made the extraordinary ordinary and the ordinary extraordinary.
Yes.
Which is what great poems do, and I think what great cinema is.
Yeah, Hitchcock was doing that as well.
Right, oh,
With
yeah.
objects in his films.
Oh,
as
right.
well.
Give an example.
Well, I just think the obvious thing Cary Grant is in Suspicion is the glass of milk, when you
Yes.
put the light in the glass of milk. And
Absolutely.
So, that sort of thing, you know.
Yes.
In fact, I think it was, there was a very long article on that in Sight and Sound some years ago, in fact, about the objects in Hitchcock's films.
Yeah.
You know. But precision is very interesting. It's Bresson, again, a master of precision.
Absolutely.
You know,
The idea that...
that poetic economy there. You look at a film like La Gendre, I mean, marvelous film,
Yeah.
this last film. You know, I mean, it's, there's no, I get bored by films have an enormous amount of exposition these days.
Yeah.
It really annoys me, actually. You think, God, get on with the story, you know, please. Michael Powell used to get very annoyed these last few years of his life. He used to walk out after the first 10 minutes, you know, and he wasn't getting the story. So
Yeah.
I do feel this impatience. There's a lot of exposition. The films are too long.
Sometimes you can't help. Sometimes you can't help it. We're going back to that, the persona where Bergman, he accidentally, he just used these two versions of the story. And I remember there's a famous story of Jean Renoir saying, I am not going to make painterly films like my father, Pierre-Auguste Renoir. I'm not going to do it. I refuse. And then there was a season of his films in Paris, and he sat down and he thought, oh my God, every one of my films was like my dad's paintings. I fell into the trap. He couldn't help it.
Well, yes and no. I would say. Because, you know, I mean, when people talk about beautiful photography in a television film, you think, well, is it really beautiful photography? What does that word beautiful really mean? It looks pretty, it's nice, nice lens and so on. But beauty is a more inner thing, actually. You know, it's choice of image, choice of camera movement, positioning, and having a sense of having a colour palette as well.
Yeah,
actually.
absolutely.
People are over-impressed by the obvious, particularly, when things look, because things can look technically so much better on television, so beautifully photographed. Well, you know, that's a rather banal term. It's so empty.
Yeah.
You know,
absolutely.
I've seen so many boring, beautifully photographed films in my life. You know.
They probably think they're making a poetic film by going out.
Yes, exactly. It's a substitute for the poetry, but it isn't. It's not.
It's not. No. Going back to the Eisenstein jump cut.
Yeah.
I think we talked over lunch again. We talked about is the equivalent for a poet using a startling image that doesn't fit, that jars the reader out, like a green moon. I think that's William Carlos Williams. A strange adjective with a noun, and I think you think that can be artificial. It can be artificially interfering with the reader's
Yes.
pleasure.
It can, because I've read so many bad, surreal poems, you know, that do that again and again, you know, it was full of shock imagery. There's nothing really there. There's no sensibility somehow, no inner life. I think it's easy to create shock effects like that and sitting impressed, you know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. One of the great things about the book is your book is that you captured the high after emerging from a dark cinema. In fact, you actually talk about that in the Hard Day's Night. I think you talk about
Hard Day's Night, yeah. There's
Yeah.
a little section here called 3 films that shaped me.
Presumably-
Spiral Staircase, Hard Day's
That's
Night,
right.
and Persona. That's
Presumably you
right.
think you can get the same high after reading a poem. Unless the same high after reading a poem. I would.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
yes you can.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I get a high from reading, you know, the early parts of Wordsworth's Prelude, for example.
Mhm.
Just the great high of the great affinity with nature that Wordsworth had, for example. There are many poems that give me that high. Yes.
Right. Brilliant.
So should we go to Distant Voices?
Yeah, should we do that, or should we throw the? Yes, let's hear that first. We hear, yeah, distant. Yeah, this is the great.
Unless there's another question before that.
No, I think I was going to throw it over, but let's hear
Okay.
that, and then
All
we'll
right.
throw it open to the audience.
Okay. Stand up again in my own poet stance here. Distant Voices, Still Lives. God, this film is so much about a culture that's long, long gone from the 50s in working class culture. And Terence Davis did put it down. There was a time when people did sing in pubs and so on. And the film has been seen as a musical by many critics, in fact, actually. Okay, Distant Voices, Still Lives, 1988, directed by Terence Davis. We shall not gather by the river, but in the beautiful pub. We'll have a sing-song to praise, then quickly batter down our bringing up. Our religion's Catholic, yet we prefer beer and candles to wine with that brute, our father, in the cellar. Two daughters fighting against the blows of a broom. A son conscripted to the army, returning to swear, light a fag, marry and escape. Lives desiring to escape tyranny. If you knew Susie, buttons and bows, taking a chance on love. Voices joined with neighbours over an ale-drenched piano. This was their opera, romance, ballad, and MGM musical. Ceremony, ritual, cry of the camera, cutting down of ambition. I want to be around to pick up the pieces when somebody breaks your heart. A family in time and memory. A street's existence under the stars. I heard my dead brother crooning loud and raw. I caught myself, a young shipping clerk, in a Liverpool, long vacated, all its celebrations eclipsed by time.
Thank you. Has anybody? I've got a couple more questions, but I'll hold those until I'll throw it open to the audience. Any questions for Alan? Yes.
What are the 39 steps?
Oh, you told me
you
on
couldn't
Facebook
resist.
the
You
other day.
couldn't.
I couldn't resist it. But I just thought I'd mention one other element of the sort of poetry of cinema,
Sure.
which is sort of the writing of scripts and,
Yes,
and the
of
way in
course.
which they appear on the page.
Absolutely.
Because going
Hot
back to
whole,
going back to kind of what you said very, very early on about, you know, the appearance of the poem
Yes.
when you were
Okay.
deciding to use the prose poem form. But you know, I don't know how much you've sort of seen this, but recently or over the last, especially since podcasts have been a thing,
Yes.
there's endless agonising about what screenplays should look like on the page.
Really?
Yeah, and it's like it really is as if they're, you know, people are writing poems, and how do you draw the eye of the reader down the page? How do you encourage them to read on in a time when it's like even more difficult than ever to make people actually read goddamn anything, especially a script, you know?
Yes.
And there's always this thing about you know, trying to get as much white space as possible onto the page, or leave as much white space, I should say, or
Yes.
people sort of write little bits right at the left-hand side of the, you know, rather than writing a sentence that goes all the way across the page, they write a very short few words, and then they, you know, you go down to the next line and the next line, and they're all very, very, very short, and it's like a way of, you know, making the whole thing feel sort of, you know, give the reader a sense of the rhythm
Right.
of the script, I suppose. So I just thought I'd bring that up as
Well,
another.
that's very interesting what you said, because that makes me think of the term scenario, which we don't often employ these days just to say, to describe a film script and so on. And if you look at the scripts of Bergman, which are very good, Bergman was a brilliant writer as well as a great director as well, that they're written in a form which isn't like the conventional script. Or if you look at films of Bill Douglas, the guy who made this wonderful short, the Bill Douglas trilogy, for example. They're written like it's like a long piece of prose actually, with dialogue inserted and so on. And it wasn't written with the obvious film script format in mind. And I think if you go back into early cinema, you find scripts, some scripts are written like that actually. Tarkovsky wrote scripts. If you look at the way he writes, the layout of his scripts. That's very interesting what you're saying. Is it just because they just want to catch somebody's attention in terms of interest in selling the script that it's done like that? Or they believe they want to do, they seriously want to change the format?
I think it's partly to try and get people to read them, but it's also to make the kind of, like I say, the reading of the script as close as possible to the actual experience of as it might be of seeing the film. And they even use kind of different fonts, things like that. Or if there's a sort of bang, they'll try to write it in very big letters,
It would annoy me if they use too many fonts.
What's that?
It would annoy me, too many fonts. Really
Not too many,
Not too many.
but just like if there's some dramatic moment they really want to emphasise, they'll
I see.
they'll sort of enlarge the font or something like that,
It's interesting because not many, as far as I know, not many poets have written screenplays. Compared to novelists, obviously you think of William Faulkner and Scott Fitzgerald.
Dylan Thomas wrote one, The Beach of
He did.
Falesa,
He did.
which wasn't made into a film, but it was adapted for radio, in fact,
Yeah.
from a Robert Louis Stevenson short story.
I wonder if it's a different process. Well, it is a different process, obviously. But
Any other questions?
yeah, any other questions? Yes.
Could I make I really find it fascinating, Alan, just you talking us through your life
Yes.
with respect to your thousands of films you've watched, obviously, narrowed it down to
39.
39. Then we've had 13 today. And it just links with something I did yesterday. I went along to Freud's museum, Freud's house, where he spent the last year of his life. And he had 2,000 items in that house, which I looked at some of those yesterday. And each of those was an object that had obviously great significance for him. And here were we looking at them, trying to make sense of what they meant and how they were in his life. So in some ways, I was listening to you, and I hear your poems very much as free associations, as if you've been on Freud's couch. I'm trying to listen and make sense of your life by listening to those, as I was trying to do yesterday, looking at all these objects within that house that he brought from Vienna, and obviously reflected who he was.
Yes.
And for you, it was film. For him, it was archaeological objects and heads and bits of antiquity and things that had been dug up.
Yes. Yes.
That was just associations I was making in listening to you.
No. I mean, it's not just film. I mean, it's music as well, and it's extracts from books, and it's a purely sensory experience. And it gets very Proustian, that, isn't it? And the whole thing, you break the object, and suddenly time memory keeps flooding back to you, and so on. You unlock the key. It's incredibly powerful. It's beyond mere nostalgia.
But it's the archaeology of the mind.
Yeah, a very nice phrase, the archaeology of the mind.
Which is what Freud was doing.
Yes, that's
He
right.
used that metaphor over and over.
Yes. Yeah.
But actually, a follow-up question to that very good question is what's the effect of regular film going on your imagination? And the novelist John Fowles said he'd seen a film a week since he was 6 years old. And this experience has undoubtedly left an indelible impression on his mode of imagination, because he dreamed in cinematic effects. His dreams had panel shots and close-ups and tracking and jump cuts. I don't know whether, does that happen? Did it go that far to you? Or
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't go that far.
No, I mean, sometimes I think film going is an addiction, and I recoil from it sometimes. And I don't-
Really?
Yeah, sometimes it's a bit too
Do you think
much.
it could be dangerous?
It can be dangerous.
What, dangerous as a poet or as a human being?
As a human being, actually. I mean, I quote Woody Allen, he said in one of his films before, he thinks of all the hours he's wasted in the cinema, looking at movies. Of course, he's being a bit tongue-in-cheek about that as well. But his constant dreaming, actually. I don't know. I think because I'm a writer, therefore I can keep my feet on the ground and so on, as a dreamer, and I'm able to use something with it practically. So.
Yeah, I don't want it to be. BFI is the right place to be saying that the film could be too dangerous.
No, I'm just thinking of friends who seem to be hopeless film addicts. And
Well, that's true. Well, yes, we know. I think
druggies,
we know some of them.
We know some of them. Yeah.
Anybody other questions? Any other questions for Alan? No?
Are we okay for time?
Are we?
Well, we're overrunning, but if
Well,
anyone's
are we
got a
all right?
question-
I've got a couple more. If
Okay.
just very. I mean, we're nearly finished, but there are a couple of.
Okay, go ahead.
Humour, use of humour.
Yes.
Like in Stanley
Oh, right.
in 2001.
I do like use of. I like puns actually as well, which is something I do like.
Right.
And I like to employ humour every now and then. Not more in stories actually. My sense of humour comes out in my prose rather than my poetry. In fact, I just want to say one thing about film and why comedy is so underrated in this world. It's terrible, really is. I mean, it's some of the greatest works of art, from Billy Wilder or Chaplin and so on. And comedies, time and time again, they really well. It's changed somewhat. They do get the Oscars and so on, but they're not regarded as serious somehow. The works of art, but comedy is a great vehicle to make searing statements about the human condition. I think it's probably interesting if one looks through all the Sight and Sound's 1,100 films ever made, how many comedies are there?
Yeah, puns can be extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Or puns can be indirect, like Jim Jarmusch's Patterson, where the protagonist is Adam Driver, and he plays a bus driver. I don't think this is by chance. I think this is Jarmusch's sense of humour. And there are a lot of there are twins in it, so there's lots of poetic echoes in it. Yeah. So that was one question. Yes. Anything else before we go?
Last one, maybe.
Yeah. One last question. Yeah. Yes. A matter of life and death.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you this over lunch. I don't know.
So,
How can poetry do what that wonderful film does, which is to switch back and forward, black and white to colour, and back and forth? How do you do it? How do you show that without telling? That's the trouble with a poem.
yeah, I know, without telling. Yes.
I mean, have you got an answer as a poet? I mean,
I don't think so.
No.
Well, you can. You can create states of consciousness which are highly poetic, like because that film is about, in many respects, about a brain seizure, and what he's going through, is he going to die or not, sort of thing.
yeah.
And it's getting back to certain kind of primal states. I think Samuel Beckett was a genius at doing that. So, look at novels like The Unnameable and so on, getting to pre-birth states and so on. In fact, it's very. This just before I go, this is very interesting, because Werner Herzog last year worked on a book of AI poetry, and it was published last year, and they fed all the stuff into the computer, and the AI generative stuff produced these poems, this kind of poem thriller of some sort, and it begins with a kind of description of pre-birth and so on. And I thought, God, this is so banal. You know, I've heard this so many times before from people who can't really write poetry, and it's like stumbling first attempt sort of thing. It got a little bit better later on. And I still felt at the end of the day you needed a tortured, wildly imaginative person to convey that really well. And I thought of Beckett's The Unnameable that captures that very kind of primal state. So it'd be very interesting if what the future of AI, if perhaps an AI machine will then write the next CINEPHILE poems instead of me, actually.
Now what we need is Werner Herzog to film a biopic of Samuel Beckett, and that Werner Herzog does something. That would
He did say that he very much. I don't know if he wrote poetry when he was very young. He said that people should write poems because it's a wonderful way to become a filmmaker. Because it teaches you concision. You know.
Werner Herzog.
Werner Herzog said that many years ago. Actually, yes.
What
She said, I prefer to take on people who study me and my filmmaking to be poets and so on. Because he now doesn't think of himself as a filmmaker. He says, I'm just a writer. He says, I'm a writer. He's redefined himself, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
And Pasolini, did he think of himself as a poet or a filmmaker? A poet.
Many things. Pasolini was
He was a great poet.
He was a great poet. He was a great journalist. He was a novelist, a short story writer, a great filmmaker. He's a great model for me, actually, I think, in terms of being a kind of. He did everything so wonderfully well, actually.
Absolutely.
Possibly.
You know, something we have. This is the last question, I promise.
Go on.
Which is, we're both translators. And this is something I mentioned.
Well, I'm not really a translator. You're much
Yes,
more.
no, but you've done a book of translation. And how far, to what extent are these poems translations of the films?
Well, I think I come back to what I said at the beginning when I talked about the Grandma's Eye. There's a kind of alchemy that goes on. Things are shifting. They're being transformed into something else. Base metal goes into gold and back again. So it's a kind of echo of the original source. There is a level in which they are translations. That's true. But I don't know really if you're going to do that. Are you trying to make a film about a film? And maybe you choose a camera rather than a pen to make the translation. I'm not sure.
No.
I would stick with the word alchemy. Actually, I'm more comfortable with that.
Not ekphrasis, which you don't.
Oh, not ekphrasis. No, these poems are not ekphrasis. Ekphrasis means a poem which is about a work of art. But these are just an odd, peculiar individual hybrid of my own. They wanted to do something original and bring together all these forms from time and memory in the prose poem form. They're not ekphrasis at all. No.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful moment to end.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Alan. Please do applaud Alan, and please go and buy the book. Buy the book. It's a wonderful collection. Wonderful book. Please buy the book, and Alan will sign copies.
Sign copies. I have copies with me if you can't get to the bookshop.
I think
It
the
could be
shop might be
closed.
closed now.
But
Okay, I'm sorry.
But you have to have cash because I can't take a credit card.
Ah.
But anyway.
Okay.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks again. No, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. That was great questions. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Okay,
Thank you.
cheers.
Thanks.